Good morning. My name is Lyn Telford, and I am here today to talk about generationally diverse teams and how we can maximize the success. Fun fact, AI helped me rename my presentation from generational diversity in healthcare, which is what my topic normally is, to something a little bit more fun. So today we'll talk about the differences between generations, how diversity can impact teamwork and communication, and recognize the benefits of diverse teams. So I work full-time at Sanford Health and I'm the quality director there. I'm a graduate of NDSU's LPN to VSN program and have the privilege of now teaching a course in that program, one course per year. I have worked with generationally diverse teams throughout my 20+ year career in healthcare. And so I'll tell a little bit about what kind of led me into my passion about generational diversity. So this was probably close to 8 years ago now, and I had joined a professional nursing organization in the state of North Dakota and went to one of their meetings, and it was a time where I'll say changing of the guard. So the previous leadership from this professional organization were stepping down and new leadership team was coming in to lead the group. And I was new to this group. I didn't know the people. Nurses have a reputation for eating their young. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if it's like that in higher education. So that was something I had experienced in the workplace. But it was really interesting to be in this professional organization meeting, and the new leaders were talking about different ways to engage members. You know, could we do, and this was before COVID, could we do virtual meetings? Could we do e-newsletters instead of the paper newsletters that we were sending out? And the previous leaders were kind of offended by their ideas of wanting to change things. And as I watched this meeting progress, I thought this is really simply a difference of what people are comfortable with, right? The people that had led that before, they valued in-person meetings, they valued frequent communication, and the younger generation had grown up with different sets of values and experiences. And so at a subsequent meeting, they were looking for topics for their fall conference, which is coming up in September, and I'm doing the presentation again 8 years later. But they asked for ideas for presentations, and I recommended generational diversity, and they said, that sounds great. Who do you know who can do it? And so I decided to become somewhat of an expert on on the study of generations. And so I've been learning more about generations since then. And so that was the first time I did the presentation. And then there happened to be someone there from Sanford who thought it was really beneficial. And so then I was able to do the presentation at Sanford a few times. Like I said, I'll be doing it again for the North Dakota Nurses Association. And then when NDSU was looking for topics for this conference, I thought, I know there's generationally diverse teams at NDSU because now that I teach there, I see that as well. So this is the first time I'm doing it outside of the context of healthcare. And so it was kind of fun to study a little bit about, or, just read about the history of higher education and how it's changed over the generations. So as we think about generational diversity, it is literally on every team that you could think of in any organization. And so these are just some of the news articles or research articles that I had found when looking. So obviously the higher ed generation gap, right? People have studied that. So this is definitely a relevant topic for higher education. So what is the definition of a generation? To the comments, because this is a challenge of not having it in presentation. A generation is a group of humans that have experienced the same historical events at the most susceptible age in their youth typically. And that is from the founder of Theory of Generations. So where do we land for the generational cohorts? And one thing I will say is that it depends upon what maybe research or what source that you use on where the birth years land. There's some variations, but for the resources that I used, the silent generation currently ages 79 to 99, baby boomers 60 to 78, Gen X 45 to 59, Gen Y or millennials, 30 to 44, and Gen Z, 12 to 29. And I haven't delved into Gen Alpha because they're not working yet, or not quite. So haven't studied much of that. One thing, I will switch back to presentation mode because I do have a QR code. We have a small group. We'll raise our hands. If you don't mind, if we go back to this slide, how many identify? I say identify because it kind of depends upon what you've learned, throughout your life as where you where you land from a birth year perspective. Anyone identify as a silent generation? Raise your hands. Baby boomers, okay. Gen X, okay, so about maybe even half of the room millennials. Resentful millennial.
I feel like I'm a Gen X. And at the end of it.
And see, it depends on it. So I was born in 1980, so I'm right at the cusp. And depending upon what resources you look at, sometimes they have millennials as late as 1983. I identify strongly as a millennial. So that is the other thing, is that when people land on the cusp, people can flip one way or the other. I know people who are millennials who say they identify as a baby boomer. So, it kind of depends on how you look at it. And then how about Gen Z? Okay, so then if we,
Depends on where I live.
so again, I'm a proud millennial. I'm a proud millennial. I can make a QR code, which we didn't get to use. And I can make a Bitmoji, but in the nursing world, if I were to be asked to document completely on paper, I would be kind of lost, because the majority of my career has been using electronic documentation. So I have skill sets like using Bitmoji or even ChatGPT. That is something that I have been really enjoying this conference. But again, doing some of those processes on paper, I would struggle with. As you guys raised your hands, this data really supports kind of how everyone falls, right? So this is higher ed is the dark red, US workforce is in the orange. One thing that's fairly different for higher education is we see a lot less Gen Z in the workforce. Makes sense, people build up experience to get there, where in the general, like in healthcare, we see a lot more Gen Z. So that was the one difference I noticed when I was looking at these slides. But we see the majority of the people in the workforce are, and this is based on age, not generation, but really in that millennial to baby boomer age range. Higher education, I thought maybe we'd see higher numbers of older generation, but it's right on track with the general workforce. So that pretty much aligned with the group that we saw in this room. And then another important way to look at the generations is by race. And so it's really hard for you guys to see, but the silent generation was obviously 78% white. And then now in the Gen Z generation, it's 52%. So that's another thing that impacts the experience as a generation, is really just that exposure, inclusivity piece. So that's just an important way that we've looked at it. And in healthcare, we've really talked about, how do we diversify our workforce? And so this shows why, because as the generations get younger, the diversity is just naturally there. And then this one also shows the percentage of full-time faculty and degree granting post-secondary education. And you can see that we have over almost 40% white female, white male, and the rest of the races much, much lower. It was interesting in the last presentation that I went to, they talked about AI or generative AI and how the information is input into like ChatGPT, for example, and how it's mostly by white people based on the work that they do. So then there's a lack of diversity even in the information that ChatGPT is giving back to us. So that was just really an interesting fun fact that I learned. Yet another way to look at generations is those who identify for sexual orientation and sexual preference. So again, we see that for the silent generation, also known as traditionalists, there were very, very, very few. As our generations have grown, we see much more diversity from the LGBTQ plus perspective as well. So again, those things all impact the way we interact with the world and what our experiences are. So when I talked about the definition of generations, and it's really about where people were in their life cycle when big events happened. For example, we all experienced COVID, but imagine my daughter who was starting kindergarten in 2020 and what that looked like for her versus me in healthcare. It was impactful for both of us, but her experience as a kindergartner, much different than what my experience was. Where we think about school shootings, right? As a child, that is nothing. We didn't practice drills for school shootings. Much different for my children now. So for our silent generation, they had lots of World War. They were pioneers in equality, which was something I'm not sure that I duly recognized as having started that early. And then The baby boomers, they grew up in a time where there was a little bit more world peace from a war perspective, more of the Cold War, doing the drills, hiding under their desks for nuclear bomb threats, those types of things. They grew up in a time where the 60s, so when they were in their teen years, in their 20s, it was turbulent with the wars in like Vietnam. Music totally changed in the 1960s for that population, kind of became how they identified themselves. There was Voting Rights Act that really changed who could vote, making things more equal. For Gen X, they saw more daycare and divorce because there was higher divorce rates at that time and two parents working outside of the home more than any other generation in the past. The world issues at that time were the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a lot of racial tension, and then immigration started to become a hot topic politically. For millennials, I was 21 in 9/11, and so that was a really impactful moment for that time of my life. Columbine, again, the school shootings, Hurricane Katrina, and then social movements of anti-racism continued to build. Black Lives Matter was founded by a millennial. And then Gen Z, they had the Sandy Hook shooting, which was a school shooting like no other, if you guys, understand what I mean by that. And then it started to progress into just public mass shootings, concerts, those types of things. COVID, which I mentioned, and then just the economic instability of the 2000s. So depending upon where you were, but a lot of times when we're in our young adulthood, those are really significant moments because we're trying to figure out who we are, what kind of world do we live in. And so those are the things that kind of shape those generations. Another important piece of how we've experienced our lives, depending upon where we were, is the evolution of technology. And so for the older generation, just the invention of the radio changed the way they received information. We think about how much information we get now in the news. And my dad's 86 years old, and I've often wondered, he's talked about when FDR was president and how there was, a lot of political discord then. And I've wondered, is it the same as it is now? But we just get information fed to us and then throw in AI where we don't know what's real and what's not. So are we really in a much worse place, or is it similar? We just get information so fast that it feels different. Aviation started becoming a way that people could travel more quickly and cheaper. It started to become affordable for the average family. Manufacturing took hold, so we were able to be much more effective with production. The defibrillator, and so some of these are focused on healthcare, but the defibrillator was invented for baby boomers. It transitioned from radio to television, so now we could see people, we could see events as they occurred. Home appliances made living or doing everyday tasks much more convenient, which allowed us to spend more time outside of the home. Air conditioning made our lives more comfortable. Birth control changed the way that families developed. And for Gen X, computer technology really changed the way they interacted with the world. Different sorts of healthcare in identifications like AIDS, music videos and new genres of music continued to build with Gen X, and then video games. I think the Gen Xers can appreciate how much video games probably changed their youth. For millennials, we went from radio to television to internet, where we could get anything we wanted right then in that moment. Wireless communications, we went from not being able to communicate outside of the home to the bag phone, which my parents used to have, the antenna on top of the car, to just having a cell phone and being able to call, and to now where we have computers in our pockets. Social media, which I would say, as an elder geriatric millennial, I can say wholeheartedly that I am so grateful that social media did not exist when I was in high school for a lot of reasons, but my kids are 9 and 12, so we're not to social media yet, but not only for capturing things that maybe I didn't want everyone in the world to see, but to be able to go home and not have school follow me home. And I think that has a significant impact to our younger generations. Electric vehicles are starting to come on, be more typical, more common. For Gen Z, virtual education, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and self-driving cars. Like, will my kids even, the cars will do parallel parking now. So when my kids start driving, will they even have to have the torturous practice that we all had of having to park between two cars when we were learning how to drive. And what I will say about technology, I think that it can be easy for us to say the younger generation has it so easy now. For example, I just said the car is going to tell them if there's something behind them. Some of the cars can parallel park. ChatGPT can help them maybe with writing prompts and those types of things. But when I go back to the social media piece, things might be easier to accomplish faster, but are they necessarily better? Right? They're much more complicated. So I think that is one thing that I try to remind all generations that, you know, it's easy to look at our younger generation and say, you have no idea how easy you have it. I mean, think about how the silence felt when their children started getting home appliances. Like, you have no idea how easy you have because you have a washer now and you don't have to do it by hand. But all of those things have come with so much more complexity, so much more responsibility. So I think that's something important to remember, that just because things might be easier to accomplish doesn't make them less complex. And then this was me getting out of my comfort zone and looking at higher education experience by generation. So I might peek up my notes a little bit for this, but for the silent generation following World War II, they saw 75% plus growth rate of colleges. The enrollment increased to 1.5 million. There was an improvement in persistence rate. So the percentage of students that started and finished their degree. There was servicemen's readjustment acts that allowed veterans to receive college education benefits. For the boomers, enrollment increased to 3.6 million. There were more legislative acts that helped make college more accessible to more students. In the Gen X era, we started to see some of that college tuition inflation with some private colleges. I believe that Harvard was the first college to increase tuition, and then other colleges started following suit, and then it became what it is, you know, today. The Gen X generation may have been their parents, but during that time frame, the first fully online degree, liberal art colleges were struggling, and then the first online university. For millennials, we see the transition to for-profit institutions. During the Obama administration, there was the college scorecard. We started to see and talk more about the student debt crisis. And in 2014, the percentage of women who earned bachelor's degrees exceeded the percentage of men for the first time. That's not that long ago. That's 10 years ago. So as I'm sitting in a room of almost all women. So Gen Z, we've seen really an extensive growth of online education. I can't really foresee many courses that don't use some sort of online capacity for the classes. Again, artificial intelligence, the enrollment cliff, which is what does it look like in 5 to 10 years with how students choose to receive their education, and then workforce shortages. So baby boomers are one of the biggest generations still working, and they're going to retire soon. And with them goes a lot of experience. And when I talk in the nursing world, the baby boomers are the last generation who did know how to document and take care of a patient without paper. And I don't mean take care of a patient, but do all of that documentation, do all of those processes on paper. Technology fails, we have downtimes, and we need to go back to those things. And when we lose that experience, I know that the younger generations will struggle. So it's really starting to understand and value those experiences and skills that each generation has. So now we're going to go through some of what typically are the characteristics, values, et cetera, of each generation, which as I go through these, think of people from each generation that you can relate to, that you know, and think about if these things seem to be what your experience has been. So for the silent generation, they tend to be disciplined, loyal, respectful, and adhere to rules. They value chain of command, traditional instruction, tangible recognition, money and position. And again, these are based on, you know, this is not to stereotype anyone. This is just what the research and evidence shows. Their strengths are that they know change comes slowly, so that they're patient, they respect authority, they're thrifty, and their limitations can be technology and fast change. So as we think about a team of individuals, and as we go through these, you can see then how conflict happens. And it's not just the teams that you work with, it's the students that you teach, It's your families, it's your friends. This has taught me a lot about just even the differences between myself and my family and giving me a different appreciation. For baby boomers, their characteristics are optimism. They have a strong work ethic and they are work centric. They value recognition, perks, prestige, position, and hierarchical structure. Their strengths are being independent, team players, very committed to goals, hardworking. And their limitations can be workaholic, competitive, and basing their self-worth on position. For Gen X, their characteristics are highly educated. They are the first generation to have the highest amount of education than previous generations. They're active, happy, task-oriented, value independence, education, family flexibility, strengths. They question the rules. So if we think back to the silent generation, they value rules. They value hierarchy. Gen X are self-reliant. They expect change. They enjoy fast pace. The limitations, they question the rules. So it's not a bad thing, but it can be for those who value rules and structure. They don't appreciate rigid schedules and they tend to be less loyal to employers. They know that they have choices. They want to have different experiences. And remember that the Gen X kids are known as the latchkey kids. They saw more daycare and divorce than other generations. My husband is a Gen Xer. He has a shirt that says Gen X raised on hose water and neglect. So when we think about how they are self-reliant and they are active and happy, they learn to be on their own. And they're an interesting generation. And in a way, I'm jealous of their independence. Millennials are a little bit more needy, I think. So millennials, characteristics, self-directed, eager, social, confident. They value a healthy work-life balance, sense of purpose, independent learning and structure. Their strengths are technology, they're inclusive, enjoy problem solving, entrepreneurial. Limitations, they're less likely to stay in a job for a long period of time and they expect more supervision and feedback. So they aren't as independent as previous generations. They appreciate a healthy work-life balance, probably because both parents work full-time and they want to have a different sort of life for themselves. And again, they appreciate being able to go to different jobs, have different experiences. But if we again think about previous generations, they're more inclusive because as the generations went along, we got more diverse naturally, and that independent learning, they might not take direction from someone as well. And then Gen Z characteristics, they're bright, pragmatic, individualistic, cautious. They value data, instant feedback, customized learning, financial and emotional security. Their strengths are that they require less direction, they appreciate diversity, they're open-minded. Limitations, underdeveloped social skills. They may be insecure and they might not appreciate lecture or test type classrooms. So they've spent more time interacting with the world through technology, which can lend to the underdeveloped social skills. We can't blame them for that or say that it's because they're antisocial. That is what the world has created for them. So stereotypes, the definition of stereotype. So Merriam-Webster defines stereotype as a standardized mental picture that is held in common by a member of a group and that represents an oversimplified opinion, attitude, or critical judgment. And according to author Jean Twenge, who wrote the book Generations, if someone is guessing about how one generation differs from another, yes, that's a stereotype. But if generations really do differ from another, average age at marriage, how religious they are, how self-confident they feel, it's not stereotyping to conclude that there are generational differences. The example she provides is that millennials do get married later, they are less religious, and they are more self-confident than previous generations. She points out that that isn't stereotyping, it's comparing groups using a scientific method. So there are many ways that people judge or discriminate against others, and age is one of those ways. So as we look at the examples, millennials stereotype Gen Z as lazy, Gen X may be stereotyped as uncaring. Baby boomers tend to see millennials as being entitled. I make the joke, you raised us, but that's because my mom's a baby boomer. Millennials think that Gen Xers and baby boomers care more about their hours worked than work produced. And Gen Z is likely to be stereotyped as young and inexperienced. So if we flip the script on those stereotypes, millennials are self-directed and Gen Z has less real world experience and may need more direction. So for if if millennials see Gen Z as being, I think it was lazy. It's because they just don't have the experience yet and they might need that direction. As I mentioned, Gen Xers tend to go with the flow, so they might come across as uncaring, but it's really that they've learned to be independent and their feathers don't get ruffled over much. Millennials know that they have choices and they know what getting different experiences does for their skill set, and they don't settle. Gen Xers and boomers are accustomed to a work culture that expects a certain amount of hours. So think about flexible work is something that we've implemented at Stanford, and there's research to show that, how productive are we really for 40 hours in a week? Look at, other countries in Europe especially have looked at different ways of having the work week. So millennials focus on what they produce versus the time spent. So they don't look at their work week and say, I put in 40 hours, I'm good. They look at what did I produce to determine whether or not they feel that they're had a successful work week. And Gen Z is younger and less experienced, but no less valuable. Generational preferences. So this really ties back into those differences between the generations. And I know it might be hard for you guys to see, so I'll just go through it. But for communication, the silent generation and the boomer generation, they prefer face-to-face. So this goes back to that nursing professional organization that kind of prompted this whole thing, was they value face-to-face. Our younger generations, they're fine with electronic. They don't need to have a face-to-face meeting. I don't know how many millennials or Gen Z, if you call me, you should have texted me first because I might not answer my phone. Gen X is kind of in the middle. They're fine with phone and email, but millennials and Gen Z, they prefer more immediate or frequent and electronic communication. Dress, another way we can judge other people. Again, I think about nursing and how the nursing uniform has changed over the years. It used to be white scrubs, which was never a good idea for nursing. And, and it's transitioned to different colors, to different styles. I mean, they make crop ones, they make flare ones, they make jogger ones. And then we will hear comments in employee surveys about, I feel like my department dresses unprofessionally. So the older generation prefers formal dress and the younger generation is much more casual. Technology, we kind of touched on this. The older generations tend to be novice only because they haven't had as much exposure to it. My dad is 86. I work with a gentleman at Guest Services who's 86. He has an Apple Watch. He has all sorts of cameras in his office or at home. He has a phone. He sends me Snapchats. My dad is like, hand me the phone with the number that I need to call and show me which button to hit. And I hope he's probably going to watch this. And so that is in no way an insult, but it is just, he's had much less exposure to it, where other people have maybe had different experiences where they have become more of an expert. So while these rules tend to be the general population, it's certainly not applicable to everyone. And then obviously the younger generations are more proficient with technology. For schedules, again, the older generations prefer that traditional schedule, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Gen X they're okay with flexibility, and the younger generations want it as flexible as possible. One thing, and I'm not sure what it's like in higher education, and when we get through this, I really want to hear your experiences, but I know in healthcare, we have so many more and more jobs going virtual. We can't be nurses, can't be doctors, we can't take our patients fully virtual. There are a lot of jobs outside of direct patient care, but I hear from managers that are doing hiring that are hiring for a clinic position and the person wants to work from home 2 days a week. It doesn't really work when we need to be available for people. You might be on the phones that day that you could do from home. Somebody calls in sick, guess what? Now you're going to be rooming patients. So I'm not sure how that translates to higher education, but I know that there are fully virtual positions in higher education, but it's not across the board. So how do we balance that? And then how do you take a team who has all of these different preferences and give them an experience that they enjoy? As a manager, if you oversee, I look at healthcare, if you oversee 50 people, it's impossible. You can't give everyone the experience that you can't individualize their experience for a group that big. But how do we start maybe questioning the way we've always done things and start looking at things differently where we can? The point of all of this information is to recognize how important diverse teams are. If we were to go back through those slides, and if we had a team that all valued the same thing and had the same characteristics and the same skill sets and the same limitations, we wouldn't accomplish nearly as much. By having breadth and depth of skills, experiences, perspectives, we can have better decision-making because there's more voices at the table with more perspectives. There's more productive collaboration, and at the end of it, which is really the goal, is to have improved overall performance. So we're filling in those gaps with the skill sets that we have with the whole team. But it takes, individually, we have all of these skill sets. We come together and we can be teams can be really one cohesive team. It's important, however, that we consider our own assumptions and biases. So as I did this work and learned more about this, I recognized a lot of assumptions and biases that I applied to other people. I'm certainly not perfect. I still make comments about my kids or, whomever, but I'm reminded about it's not maybe a choice a person makes to not be great at technology or to be rigid with a schedule. It is how they were brought up in the world, how the world was at the time that they were brought up in it. Find your common purpose. So you can take a group of people and maybe use AI to help you find a common purpose, but you can always find a shared goal that you want to achieve. And then that helps break down those barriers. It helps give more grace. And then share your expertise and then be willing to learn from others. And I think there was, when I had done this presentation at Sanford, I believe it was last year, at the end, I did ask for experiences, which I will do for this group as well. But I asked her experiences, and I had a nurse raise her hand, and she was maybe an older baby boomer. And she said, I really feel like I'm no longer wanted in my department because I don't move as fast, because she probably spends more time at the bedside with the patient because she's not obsessed with the electronic medical record, which we have trained our younger generations to do. It is not their fault. We have put them in front of a computer and said, you need to answer all of these questions. And we've created that process. And the older generation remembers the days where you just talk to your patient and then you document it later. And so she said, I don't feel welcome anymore. And so we discussed that. And obviously, I think that's horrible, right? That's kind of the goal of this, is we don't want anyone to feel that they're not welcome as part of a team. And that takes us having that insight to recognize where we apply those assumptions and biases. Then there was a Gen Z nurse who raised her hand, and she said, I feel the same way because I'm told I ask too many questions. And she's learning. And so here we had two nurses on the opposite ends of the generation gap who felt like they weren't welcome, that they didn't feel that they belonged on the team. And so how do we take those two nurses, put them together, and I mean, really you'd have like the perfect nurse if you put those two people together. So how do we take those skills and those experiences and perspectives that we all have to really maximize our effectiveness as teams? So that brings us to some prompting questions I have. What are some generational shaping moments for you that I didn't mention? What experiences with generational differences have you had? What stereotypes have you applied to others or have been applied to you?
Differences that I had, I just came from managing a team actually in healthcare, the supply chain side. And I had a baby boomer, a millennial, and a Gen Z all on my team. And so we were all kind of different age groups, but we all had to come together. And so I think it was just kind of, we all just sat down and learned, you're super, like the baby boomer. Yeah, we were just switching technologies too. So we knew, and she admitted that's going to be harder for me. And they're like, I'll help you with that. And then, but she, her worth ethic was through the roof. So it was she is the example for how I need you to be working, not at the computer, So I think it was just all just us recognizing our strengths and our weaknesses and being open with them. And so that way, hey, I can help you with that, or I can help you with that.
I'm new to NDSU, and I recently worked at a marketing agency where I would say 90% of the employees and even leadership were millennials or Gen Z. So it was very casual, very flexible. I was working from home pretty much whenever I wanted. It would be, 2-3 days a week. And you didn't have to tell anybody. You would just work from home, get your work done. And then I came here and it was definitely a different shift in terms of flexibility. It was the same dress for your day type of schedule, which is nice, but at least in my department, they will give you 1 day a week at home, but you have to sign a contract, a designated day. And I think it reflects just age, generation, and leadership and their different values.
I think the challenge, and I think that's something I might need to add to this is as for the industries that will never be able to be that flexible, higher education, secondary education, healthcare, banks, you know, how are we going to recruit as the older generation retires? How are we going to recruit younger generations when they have options in other industries where that flexibility exists? I know in healthcare, we talk about how do we change care delivery so there is more virtual care. In higher education, there's more virtual options, but how do we recruit and retain people when they have those options elsewhere?
I came from a tech industry company before coming to NDSU 6 years ago. And I think the Gen Xers, millennials probably have really seen the globalization of, at least that's what it feels like to me. It was sort of in that window that the world became small and your coworkers could be anywhere and you're communicating with them. And there's pluses and there's minuses. It also, I think, became the age of outsourcing. And for my kids, you know, they're early 20s now. That's just the way it's always been. But it was a definite shift during my working career.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's power distance that can exist within the generations as well. And power distance is really a perceived difference in power between one person and another. And so when we think about, you know, being new to NDSU, you may look at your colleagues as having, you know, they've been here longer, they have that longevity. How do we create a culture where whether you're young or older or new or tenured, that we've created a culture and a team where people are just comfortable asking questions and speaking up? Do you feel like you've had any of those stereotypes applied to you?
Early on in my career, I would say there was that with the older generations of looking at you like, you don't know what you're talking about, kind of. Because you're too young, you haven't, which granted, some of it was probably the experience part of it, but yeah. Having that sense of that, again, looking at younger generations is you just don't know what you're talking about.
And that's the, you know, we look at those values of those generations and they valued hierarchy. And the younger generations are more inclusive, open-minded. And again, we can help older generations get there just as they can help us with work ethic. You know, there's a really good book called Generations that I didn't use when I first developed this, but has been helpful as I've added things to it that I recommend people read if they have interest in learning more about the generations. Were there any questions or comments and anything else?
Who's the author of that?
Jean Twang, ENGE, and it's Jean, JEA. Well, right on time, I guess. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.